Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. For some of us, it's a chilly Monday as we start talking about gardening. What else would you do on a Monday? So let's spend the next 90 minutes answering questions, sharing stories, and just getting involved in the gardening mindset. Even though the garden is starting to fade for many of us, it doesn't mean the season is over. In fact, I think the gardening season lasts all year round, even when we're not physically out in the garden. And one of the ways to keep it going year round is with a garden journal, of course, and that's going to be a big focus today. For those of you who don't have a journal yet and are wondering about it, hopefully we'll get you headed in the right direction with some ideas on how to start journaling. For those of you who already have a garden journal, maybe you'll pick up some new ideas of information you can add to your garden journal. And of course, we'll be sharing all the different tips, and I hope you will be participating in that. If you are a garden journaler, go ahead and tell us some of the things that you like to do and what makes garden journaling easy and productive for you. Let's go ahead and start. Chris was wondering about the tray that I have in some of my videos, the green potting tray. And thank you, Jay, for giving some links to that. I believe the brand I have is called Tidy Tray. And I've had mine for years and years. I think they've actually modified the design over the years. But you can do a simple search, as Jay pointed out, of potting tray or tidy tray, and that'll give you a good idea of the kind of thing you can add to your potting setup. And I like it. I typically keep potting soil in it year round. And that means if I dig something up and want to put it in a pot, I know where potting soil is. I'll probably need to moisten it before I put a plant in, of course. But it's a nice, easy way to have a seeding and potting setup with a tray that just kind of stays in that spot year round. So that's the approach that I take. Rev Kai says, I got my journal ready to take some notes. And that actually is a great way to start the discussion today. Taking notes. A garden journal can be as formal or informal as you want it to be. I know journalers who will spend one time a week, one time a month, 3 times a week, but they have a set time that they'll sit down and they'll do their garden journal. And I've actually met a few that will do it every day and treat it more like a diary or a personal journal. That's a great idea. I like to do it as Rev Kai was just mentioning. If I come across something that I think is worthy of documenting, I just write it down in my journal, or I'll film it and document it that way, or I'll take a picture of it. I'll do something to document that one thing that I wanted to remember. So for me, journaling isn't a scheduled activity. I journal as I come across those things that I want to remember. And particularly as you garden more and more, you'll have a lot of these ideas, a lot of these tips, a lot of these methods committed to memory. And so you won't write them down in your journal because you already know them. I'll make note of the things that are different or new, even if it is something that I've been doing for years and years. So it's you doing this for you and your garden in whichever manner you are most comfortable with. I did a video a couple years ago, and no doubt Jay will give you a link to it here in a little bit, that lists a series of things that you can include in your garden journal. And I've had nice formal journals that I bought that say garden journal on the front, and they have the chapters and the pages and the grids and all those things for a nice formal garden journal. But I find, because of how I do it, which is just writing down a note and writing down an idea and documenting activities. I really like just using a spiral notebook. And I'll put whatever the year or series of years happens to be on the outside of that notebook, and I'll hand write garden journal on it. And then as things happen, I'll document those things that go into my garden journal. Robin sent me some photos of fantastic, beautiful, hand-bound journals that she makes and that she gives as gifts. I think that's a fantastic idea. A beautiful garden journal resting on a table or on your shelf is one of those conversation pieces that you can now share your garden with others. You have somebody over in a social setting and they see that beautiful hand-bound garden journal and ask you about it. And then, of course, the conversation turns to gardening, and what can be better than that? So anything from loose paper to a spiral notebook to handmade, hand-bound journals to store-bought journals, it really doesn't matter. It's whatever you prefer and whatever you think you're going to use. That's really the best thing to do it. So soil and margaritas, hola to you as well as hola to Ultimate Gardening. Thank you for that. Glad to see both of you here today. KT says, morning, I started a gardening journal 5 years ago, and it's a binder. Just use loose leaf paper, what I planted and where, and the time of day for full sun, etc. Great idea. And some of the most productive garden journals that I've seen from fellow gardeners are the loose leaf binders like this. A friend of mine does a garden journal in a binder and includes those sheets that you can buy that are intended to put photos into a photo album. But instead of putting the photos in those sleeves, she puts the seed packets. And so she's got her garden journal and she keeps track of all the things she's doing in her garden. And that's where she keeps the empty seed packets, or she'll just cut off the front of the seed packet so that she documents what it is she's growing in her garden that matches with that particular garden journal. I've done the same thing with photos, where I'll take before and after photos and use that as documentation for what my garden did in a particular year. I have another friend who also uses the loose leaf binder idea, and she kind of mixes all of those things that I just talked about. She will take pictures of where she's putting the plants into her garden. And then later in the season, particularly like if it's a flower or if it's a vegetable that she's harvested, she'll take pictures of that. And then she will take a typical software program. You can do it on Word, you can do it on PowerPoint, but she'll take those photos and put them into a document and then put the text that explains what it is those photos represent. So she'll have a page for a particular variety of plant. She'll describe the variety. She'll have a photo of where she planted it. She'll have a photo of the result at the end of the season. She'll print that out on a single sheet of paper, and that goes into her garden journal. So by the end of the season, she's got pages and pages of these sheets of photos and description to include lessons learned, and that's the garden journal for the year. For me, that's a little bit extra work. I just prefer to handwrite everything. But if you've got those skills and you want a really good document that records what you've accomplished in the garden, think about doing something like that. Actually turning it into essentially a book with the photos and the description and the results of your garden. So you can see the ideas really run the spectrum on this. Robin's Container Garden is the one I was just telling you about, making the handmade journals. I've tried a diary type journal, but I don't write in it every day. So with my new style, the ones I make, I can just note the date and don't have wasted pages. That's really a good point, Robin. And that's one reason why I don't do the store-bought journals much. I've got a bunch of store-bought journals that are empty because I don't necessarily follow the format that they put into place. And so I end up with a journal of 100 pages, and maybe only 16 of the pages are used because the rest of the pages don't match what I'm documenting. And so by making your own, you can make it match exactly your style of gardening and your style of documentation. And that's what a garden journal is really about. It's documenting your garden in whatever way you want. The reason I think documentation is important is because there are things we should remember. In that video that I did about journals, I pulled out some of my journals and started reading through them. And as I show in that video, I came across information that I had completely forgotten. In one of the journals, I wrote down the day I started my Master Gardener training. I'd forgotten what that day was, but I wrote it in my garden journal. And there are a lot of those type of things that I have recorded in my journals. When I build a bed or a series of beds, I put that date into my journal. And so years later, if I'm wondering, when did I put that bed in? For a wooden garden bed, for instance, and starting to fall apart, maybe you need to replace some of the wood, and you begin thinking, how old is this bed? You can go to your garden journal and tell exactly how old that bed is if that's the kind of stuff that you document. There are also the events in the garden that I like to document. I've talked about this before, the first ladybug, the first hummingbird, the first raspberry that you eat in the garden. I love documenting those kind of things. Yesterday, I had one of those events that's worthy, in my mind, of putting into a garden journal. I did the video this last week where I talked about lessons learned in the garden. And one of the lessons that I learned in my garden was that my fully enclosed garden is fully enclosed and keeps the predators out, and so the mice come into it. So I have a mice problem in that particular garden area. Yesterday, I was in the garden, and 5 feet over my head, an owl flew over the garden, flew over my head, and was holding a mouse in its talons. Well, that just helps me identify that, yes, the owls in my area are hunting the mice. And it just kind of shows me that sometimes by keeping one pest out, you keep another pest in. And so I'm not going to do or undo that garden area because it's more important to keep the deer out. I can trap the mice. But that's noteworthy. The day that the owl flew over my head carrying a mouse, as though to say, I caught this mouse in your neighbor's yard, not yours. See you later, Scott. I like stuff like that. Those are the kind of stories that I'll keep track of in a journal to talk with other gardeners at some point, like I am with you. Tammy says, I always have my phone with me in the garden. I snap a picture, then use the edit functions to mark where things are planted or whatever I'm taking a picture of. This also documents the date. Excellent idea. Excellent idea. I use my phone a lot in the garden as well for similar ideas. I don't go to that extreme. I will go back and then check the date and move that photo usually to another document. But that's because I use my phone differently. Great idea. If you use your phone a lot, set up a garden journal section on your phone of all those photos with the date and what it is that you're documenting. That's a great idea. Rudimental Gardening uses the garden planner software from GrowVeg. GrowVeg is a great YouTube channel with lots of good information, and they've got a wonderful planner. Let's see, which has a separate journal module to document watering, fertilizer, harvesting, pest info, and observations for each garden season. Great idea, great idea. And if you're a software type of person, absolutely. There's a lot of good software out there that allows you to put in that information. And you raise some really good points. These are good tips as you put your garden journal together and try to figure out what it is you want to keep track of. Because there's just so much information out there, it's difficult to log all of it. And so you have to prioritize what's most important for you. But watering is a great idea. I've noticed this year in particular, with some of the extreme temperatures that we had, that watering at different times of day had different results. Those are the kind of things I think are great to document in a journal. Fertilizers. If you use fertilizers, especially when you try different types of fertilizers and you see different results in your plants, you have to document those kind of things so that you don't forget or lose that information. In the future, when you want to fertilize again, you've got the documentation of what worked or what, more importantly, maybe didn't work when you use fertilizers. Harvesting is a huge aspect, I think, of journaling. And how you document your harvest is completely up to you. I like to weigh much of what I harvest. And so, for example, this year, I made a point to weigh every single squash and zucchini that I harvested, so that I can mention it in future videos and on live streams, but also just to see what worked and what didn't. I had 3 zucchini plants, and they gave me almost exactly 40 pounds of zucchini. Now, I did have a house sitter for a while when I was doing some traveling this summer, and I'm not sure how much of the zucchini she harvested. She did tell me that she did use some of it, but 3 plants gave me more than 40 pounds of the zucchini. Why I think that's important is that tells me that on average, each plant should give me about 14 pounds of zucchini. And so if I'm asked the question about growing zucchini and how much one plant will produce, I can say, well, my zucchini plants on average produce about 14 pounds of zucchini. Next year, I'll do the same thing. I've done it in years past. Some years are better, some years are worse. But by using a standard measurement from one year to the next, you can get an idea of how your garden's doing and how you are doing as a gardener, because you have comparisons, literally apple to apple comparisons, or in this case, zucchini to zucchini comparisons, if you choose something like weight. Quantity is another great factor that a lot of people use. This year, I tried a new type of squash, delicata squash. Well, I know that of the couple plants that I put into my garden, I was able to harvest 8 delicata squashes. If I choose to grow that again in the future, now I have a reference point of how many I get. I do the same thing with my pumpkins. My daughter and son-in-law and granddaughters came over this last week to take the pumpkins that I grew for them. I grew 4 of the jack-o'-lantern pumpkins that were perfect size, that were beautiful, and the 4 of them took those pumpkins home. I grew those 4 on 2 plants. That goes into my journal. Next year, to grow 4 pumpkins means I need to have at least 2 pumpkin vines based on how I do it and where I'm growing. When I have more grandkids come to visit, I'll have to grow more of those pumpkin vines to be able to get the same kind of harvest. So you can see how you can draw correlations to what you're doing, what the result is, and then use that as part of your garden planning for the future. And then, as Rudimental Gardening points out, the pest information is also extremely important. As I mentioned, the mice for me were one of those things that I hadn't had that issue before. Well, those are the kind of things that go into my journal. I have mice. Why did I have mice? How do I deal with those mice in the future? The other type of pests, I didn't really have much in my garden this year at all. I had some aphids, but this year I didn't have flea beetles. And I didn't have really anything else that I can think of that I've had in the past that created a problem with my plants. Okay, this is a big reason why I think garden journals are important. I can note that in the past, last year in particular, I had a huge infestation of aphids on some of my bushes by my driveway. I also had a pretty serious problem with flea beetles last year, though it wasn't terrible. And I did have some squash bugs that I had to deal with. This year, I had none of those, but I did have grasshoppers. What did I do different? Well, this year, in my third season, I had more flowers, I had more herbs, I allowed more of the weeds to grow in my garden, and all of that together, my analysis says, brought in more of the beneficial predatory insects. And I did see more of those little wasps and of those lacewings and of those ladybugs in my garden. So my analysis says there's a correlation to more variety of plants and allowing more of those native weeds and more of those flowers and herbs to grow. I saw the same thing at the Galileo Garden almost a decade ago now. Over a series of years, after planting all those different types of plants, the pest problem in the garden dropped dramatically. So I can look back to my journals from those days, I can look to my recent journals, and I can see a trend as my gardening methods are modified, as I try new things, as I note successes in one area or another, and the correlation to an increase or decrease in the pests in the garden. If you have a journal for no other reason than documenting the pests, you'll probably note some successes in the future because you've got that focus and the documentation to support whatever your analysis shows. When I was saying, well, grasshoppers could indicate that the plants have higher Brix levels and lesser insects aren't as interested according to the people at the AEA. Good idea. So Brix is the sugar level that's in the plants. And my soil is improving and my plants this year were much healthier than they have been in the past. And I had some pretty good harvests. So that's a good point. I hadn't actually thought about that. I don't have a refractometer, though that is in my list of things to get over the holiday season. Maybe I can talk one of my relatives into getting me a refractometer, which is what measures the Brix levels. And then I can add that to my garden journal, documenting the sugar levels within my garden. I like that idea a lot. And you're right, it could be that the grasshoppers did have a sweeter tooth and they liked my plants more this year than they have in years past. But in talking with other gardeners, I had my garden club meeting this last weekend. Others had an increase in grasshoppers as well. I also noticed that inside my greenhouse, you can actually see it in my recent video, one of the grasshoppers crawling up the pepper plant. I had grasshoppers get into my greenhouse. I really didn't do much to get rid of them. They weren't a huge problem, but I essentially trapped the grasshoppers inside the greenhouse, so they had no choice but to eat those plants. The next phase for me with grasshoppers is, yes, maybe analyzing how productive my garden was this year and that brought in the grasshoppers. Or maybe there was another factor, which is why others in my area had an increase in grasshoppers as well. And that raises a huge part of journaling, I think, which is the weather documentation. It's documenting the low temperatures, the high temperatures, the wind, the precipitation, whatever you think is important for your garden as far as the weather is concerned, you should be documenting those kind of things. This last week, I had my first freeze. Now, this year's freeze was almost 2 weeks later than my first freeze last year. In fact, it's already flannel weather because the house is kind of cold this morning. And so those are the kind of things to document as far as trends are concerned. 2 years ago, the freeze was almost a month earlier than it was this year. We just had a really weird freak Arctic storm come through and drop the weather dramatically in September. That's unusual, but that's the kind of thing to document. Because if that storm 2 years ago happened again last year and happened again this year, now I might note that my climate is changing enough that it should influence how I garden, that my season is going to be shorter than expected. This year, my season was longer than expected. So there's no patterns yet over the course of these last 3 years at this house in this new garden, but I'm documenting it. I'm keeping track of what the patterns are as I get used to this new area, because my altitude is different than the house that I lived at before. The weather patterns, even though I'm only about 15 miles away, the weather patterns are different. So I have to get used to the new weather patterns and how they influence my gardening. A journal of whatever type is a great way to keep track of the weather and what's happening in your garden. Rachel says, I live in a cul-de-sac and my neighbors use lawn services. I track the truck sightings and compare with leaf changes and insect activity. Interesting. That's a new one on me. That's a really good idea. If you start seeing things happening in your garden, document those things that are happening outside your garden that might have an influence on them. I really like that idea. Bohemian Herbology says, so very important to at least mentally note first and last freeze and water patterns. Absolutely. And so I could go back and do exactly that. Note when the first freeze was in autumn and when the last freeze was in spring, and you begin to see those patterns. Now, I've mentioned this in some of my videos, and I agree completely. Those are wonderful things to document. For me, and this area in particular, this part of Colorado, our official last freeze is May 18th. That's the date I use. Yes, that is usually pretty close to the last freeze, and it's been pretty accurate within a week or two in as many years as I can remember. But another aspect to weather and climate and your garden goes beyond just the last freeze. This last year, I did a really good job documenting the soil temperature within my garden. So I've added that to my garden journaling, not just the outside air temperature, but the actual soil temperature. And so even though I had a relatively early last freeze, the nights were still cold. They weren't freezing, but they were cold. And the days didn't warm up as quickly as they often do, which meant that the soil temperature wasn't warming. And so while the outside air temperature should have allowed me to put my tomatoes and my peppers in the ground early, by measuring the soil temperature, I actually put those plants in the ground later than normal for me. So my garden got started about a week, almost 10 days in some cases, later than average, because I started adding soil temperature to the list of the many things that I'm documenting and tracking in the garden. And that's one reason I think I had such a productive tomato and pepper year, because I waited until the soil was appropriate for those plants. So as soon as they started growing, they grew very well. If you put those type of plants in cold soil, it can stunt the plant and it can actually affect the growth and future production of that plant. So whether you have thought about doing it, maybe you should be thinking about adding soil temperature as one of those elements that you'll start measuring. It worked great for me this year. It's one of those things that was a little bit different, and I think I can draw that correlation to successful harvest and a late start because of the soil temperature. Steve Robin's Container Garden is saying, I think our frost dates are very similar. That's incredible considering you're in Colorado and I'm in Scotland. Yeah, and so I'm actually not as far north as you are in Scotland, but the ocean and the mountains definitely make a big difference. But yeah, and that actually goes to show how we can live in different areas with completely different weather patterns, but something as simple as a frost date might be the same. But I know Robin is close to Eli and Kate from In the Garden with Eli and Kate. Their season is dramatically different than mine. And so the frost date is one aspect. And yes, I agree. Very important to not only document it, but compare it to other gardeners, but also then to recognize how that influences our gardening. I got a roller coaster here in Colorado. We will have crazy extremes, and I've talked about that in videos in the past and other live streams where it's high and it's low and it's high and it's low, and then suddenly it's not freezing anymore. Whereas in the UK and Scotland in particular, it tends to be more gradual of a warm up, and not the big danger of a sudden drop in temperature that could happen like I have here in Colorado. I think that's one of those things that you can get together with other gardeners and compare your notes in the garden journal. You compare the notes of things like the frost dates, and then you compare the notes of what that means in your garden. And especially if you travel and you like to see the results that other gardeners are getting, I think that's one of those things you can definitely use to your advantage. Mr. McGregor's Homestead, Steve from the Garden, Papa's almost tastes like banana pudding with a slight hint of mango flavor. And so I think Mr. McGregor's talking to Steve. He's talking about Papa's. Papa's are actually one of those things that, and I'll bring it back to the discussion on the garden journal. I tried growing pawpaws at the Galileo School Garden, did okay. It's one of those plants that actually can do quite well in the United States, but very few gardeners even know about it. And I agree, that's what I understand. It's like a banana custard fruit, but I had difficulty with it. I haven't started growing them in this garden yet. I think I'm going to, but I still have those notes from what worked and what didn't work in the past. So if I choose to use grow pawpaws again, I've at least tried it and figured out what may or may not be the best way to grow them, and then use that to my benefit. You don't have to use your garden journal every single year. It's just a source of documentation. And so it's been 5 years since I left the Galileo Garden. And so that information that I put into my journals and the photos I took 5 years ago is still suitable for today. I can just go back and pull out that information as needed. Whereas some of the information like the weather tracking and the pest patterns may be more important to refer to from one year to the next. Totally up to you. Totally up to you in how you want to put it all together. Jennifer would love advice on how to deal with cutworms. My fall garden is getting shredded to stems. Now, cutworms are one of those things that depends on how much effort you want to take. So if you have cutworms and you know that you've got cutworms, one of the things you can actually do is wrap the stems with foil. You can take toilet paper tubes and put a wall around your plants. You'll often see that as a way to deal with the cutworms, is you actually put a barrier between the cutworm and your plant so that they can't eat the stem. I think a more important way to deal with cutworms is to think about them months before they become a problem. Now, it does depend on the specific type of cutworm you have, but essentially it's a larva that is in the soil, and when it comes out of the soil, it's looking for something to eat, and it eats your plant. Once you know the type of pest you have, in this case a cutworm, you can learn more about it and begin to recognize the life cycle. So if it is one of those kind of pests that will be a larva in the soil, often just by disrupting the soil, you can break that life cycle, bring that larva up to the surface, and then deal with them. Pick them out, let your chickens run in the garden, whatever method works best for you. But for me, that is a good reason to amend your beds in spring. If you like to add compost as a soil amendment, spread a couple inches of compost on your beds in early spring. Dig it in, and by digging it in, by taking that lower soil and turning it up to the top, you'll expose a lot of that larva. That will kill some of it. Other predators will find it, especially the birds, if they discover your garden, will come and eat some of that larva. And that can actually cut down on a pest like cutworm. No-dig gardening is a wonderful idea, but it can add to problems like the cutworms or all those other pests that are burrowing into the ground. And if you're not disturbing the ground, you're just really helping their population grow. And then once they emerge, you've got to do something like protect your plants. There are some nematodes that you can look for, and beneficial nematodes that you can add to your soil. And some of those nematodes will feast on some of the larva that's in the soil. So there's a few different options like that to consider. But I would say go ahead and try to find out just exactly what kind of worm you have. Figure out the life cycle and see if you can disrupt that life cycle to really have the best success. Okay, char 8A. My giant Marconi is starting to produce beautifully, but we're getting temps this week in lower 40s. Wondering if it will survive if I cover it well. It should. Again, a lot of this depends on the specific plants, the specific weather patterns, and how effective your protection is. So for example, here in Colorado, this week we had freezing temperatures, and the long range forecast for the next 10 days is no more freezing temperatures. Again, it's a roller coaster. And so I can go out and cover my plants that I want to save with a plastic sheet. And a plastic sheet will usually add 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit of protection, a degree and a half or maybe 2 degrees Celsius of protection. And so the 40s, if you want to keep above the 40 degree Fahrenheit, yeah, throwing a sheet of plastic over is probably enough to protect it. But look out long term. For me, if I just get that one night of protection, I can usually get another 2 weeks of growing in my garden. If your temperatures are dropping and will continue to drop, that's another factor. Covering will help, and it will help protect the plants, but as the temperature gets cooler, you may need to add a second layer of protection. And you need to be aware that the plant is probably going to lose a lot of its production as those temperatures fall. So it should survive. The next question is what your future weather is and how productive it'll be. If temperatures rise again, then yes, that initial protection is probably all that you'll need. And I do a lot of that. Just that one day, and then I don't need to cover after that because the plants are protected. Jen says, I tried growing Brussels sprouts this year. Each plant's about 3 feet and producing really well. Good for you, taking the frosty weather like a champ. And that's another great thing, that especially if you try something new and the weather does start changing, document it. Brussels sprouts like cold weather, and they can actually be very productive in that. That's the kind of stuff to write down and keep track of. And if the Brussels sprouts worked well for you this year, even in the face of the cold weather, then try it again next year and start keeping a track record of the Brussels sprouts in your garden. I think that's a great idea. Raleigh Fields, thanks for the help, everyone. Since it already frosted, I'll log it and maybe try some before the first frost next year and see which ends up working best in our area. And that's another great thing to do in the journals is comparison. I'll try 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different types of beans, and I'll document what works best. I'll try different types of tomatoes, and I'll document what works best. It's the comparison, and some things will drop out. And so as I mentioned in a recent video, I tried a couple new cucumber varieties. I wasn't that impressed. Okay, now I know what varieties I've tried, which ones work best for me, and which ones I'm not going to do again. And so I'll go back to the standard successful ones, maybe try something different in the year or two, but it's a good way to keep a track record for your garden and make sure that you're finding what works best in your garden, so that in that year where you just don't want to work, you don't want to experiment, you don't want to try something new, you just want to go to the old standards that you know will be successful, well, you've got documentation that tells you exactly what those old standards are, and it can really be an easy way to garden by just growing what you know will do well. And that's one of those things that's a big reason why I use the garden journal. Every year something new, every year I'm experimenting, but I'm documenting, because at some point in my elder years, I still don't think I'm that old, but in my elder years, when I want to garden but don't want to work that hard, I'll know what works. I'll know what takes the least amount of effort to get the best results. And that'll keep me gardening well into my 90s, hopefully, by getting out and just taking it easy, but still having those successes. And the journal is just about the best place that you can document those successes. Some of these store-bought journals I've seen have pages that are set aside just to document the successes from each growing season. If you're one of those that are tracking by plant, by all means, put the successes that you had with that plant as part of that documentation. And then when you could go back as you're trying to figure out what you're going to do and where you're going to do it and when you're going to do it, well, that success page can help guide you in your planning for each successive season. I think that's one of those wonderful things, that it's the failures that we probably learn the most from. And so documenting all those failures are an important aspect of your journal as well. The analysis for why it was a failure is important, but also the solution. What are you going to learn from that failure to hopefully promote a change to lead to success? That's a wonderful way to approach garden journals. What went wrong and what am I going to do different? Well, when you do that thing differently and it works, you got to make sure you have a place in your journal to track that. And you can note where the string started. If in 2019 you put a plant in and it didn't work, and then in 2020 you tried something new, and in 2021 you shifted something different still, and then in 2022 you had success, by all means document that success. And it may be a good idea to actually say, refer to Garden Journal in 2019, so that if you ever want to revisit it, you can track that string of progress, that string of education and learning and experimentation. For me, there are some of those things that I've lost to my memory. I know that the Market More cucumber does great in my garden. Well, I know that because years and years and years ago, I tried different cucumbers and the Market More ended up being the best. And then I planted more each year and it was always the best. I know that now. If you have that cross-referencing, I could go back to some journal in the past and find out when it started. Find out the first year that I started growing the Market More 76 variety of cucumber. I could do that. It's not that important because I like it. I know I like it. I know I've learned to like it, and I know I'll continue growing it. But especially as you're new on your garden journey, cross-referencing your garden journals and the information from one year to another can also help you out as you're developing that knowledge and that experience. So there's a suggestion. Again, totally how you want to do it that will make a difference when it all comes down to the successes and the failures that you have. Britt Lee, I'm grieving my garden because I'll be selling my house here soon. I have to start over. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That's one of those things I hope you can take some of your garden with you as you move. I've had here, since I moved into Colorado, I've had 1, 2, 3 moves from my original house. I've lived in 4 houses in 25 years here in Colorado. The strawberries and the raspberries that I'm growing in my garden in this house are the same strawberries and raspberries that I was growing in that original house more than 20 years ago, because I potted up some of those raspberries and I potted up some of those strawberries, and I took them with me to each of the houses where I was going to start a garden. I did the same thing with the rhubarb. The rhubarb goes back 3 houses, but it's the same kind of thing. If you can pot up some of your garden and take it with you, hopefully you can keep some of those memories alive, and it'll help the grieving process a little bit. But sorry to hear that. I hope your next house and next garden will be wonderful, especially if you can take some of that with you. Linda says, 2022, I've had my best garden yet. I know it's because of the great information from Gardener Scott. Well, thank you for that. And I appreciate that. That's one of those things that I don't do as much of, but I have done in my garden journal. I do it more on the spreadsheets that I'll keep track of. But if I come across a video or come across a blog or come across a PDF file from a university that is important, I actually have a document that I've titled Good Info. And when I come across any of that information, I'll add it as a URL to that document of Good Info. And that's part of my garden journal. I never print it out. It's purely a software document I have on my computer. And so if I want to recall good information about soil or pests or whatever, I can go to my Good Info document, and I've got it all categorized. So I've got soil, and I might have 12 links to different sites and videos on soil. And I have one on trying to go through my head, caterpillars. I know I've got one on caterpillars, and I've got a biochar, and anyway, all these different gardening topics. I'll put my links underneath that. So yeah, if you come across a gardener video or Gardener Scott video that you like, that is helpful, go ahead and start a spreadsheet. And the Grow Veg planner, go ahead and add that to your spreadsheet. And in the garden with Eli and Kate, talking about greenhouses, go ahead and add that link to your spreadsheet. That's a way to have a garden journal that may be kind of outside what you're thinking. It doesn't have to be a written document. You can make this whatever you want it to be. And so my Good Info document is one of those that I'll go back periodically. If I'm going to make a video and there's information I want to include in that video and I just can't quite remember the source, I usually have already put a link in my document to that source that I can kind of sort of remember, and then go straight to it, refresh my memory, and start fresh with you with a new video, or just go out to my garden and use that information in my garden if it's for a plant that I want to deal with. So use this however you want to do it. That's really what it comes down to, is whatever works best for you is really what it deals with. And so Steve from the garden is saying, I keep my strawberry bed covered by bird netting. Great idea. I'm trying to figure out a way this year, and this is one of those things that I've been keeping track of. I have 2 beds, the beds that I have my garden arch in, and that's where I have strawberries. This year, 3 times now, as the plants were growing to a nice good size, the deer came and ate the strawberries. And I got a pretty good harvest from the backside bed, but now I've got to figure out how to protect my strawberries from the deer 3 times this year, so I have to assume it's going to be at least 3 times next year. And bird netting is really the solution I'm planning to use on my strawberry beds too. I'm just trying to figure out a small hoop system because they're narrower beds than I have in other areas. And so, don't know if I'll do a video about this or not once I figure it out, but I'll do a small hoop over the strawberries and then put bird netting that runs the length of that bed. So glad to hear you're doing that, Steve, because I think that can be a solution if you've got pests that are eating your strawberries. Bud says, I have to confess that I often forget to journal, but I'm working to be more consistent and timelier in logging. The transition from the garden to the house often includes distraction. And that's one reason why I know the people who will sit down every Sunday morning or every Thursday night or whatever the time period is. I know people that will do it almost every morning that work in their garden journal. It's to jog the memory and to like force them to write down the things that they want to do in their garden. I have the same problem, but I'll think of something and then go into the house and it's like, what was that thing? You know how it is, which is why the phone is a great idea if you're in the garden. If there's something like that that I want to document, I'll often just take a picture of it. Not necessarily as part of the documentation, but as part of a way to jog my memory so that when I get into the house, I know what it is that I want to document. But, you know, don't feel bad. I forget to journal all the time. And I think that's part of just gardening. There's stuff that just keeps us busy and we may not remember some of the things we wanted to remember, which is why if you can set up that system for you that works well, that you can remember and that you can document, whatever works for you is really the answer. And it's especially the more you garden, you might be able to get to that point where you could say, I've forgotten more about gardening than most new gardeners know. And the reason I've forgotten so much about gardening is because I've forgotten to journal so much about gardening. There are a lot of things you learn that you just forget. And experience is filled with examples of those kind of things that you wish you had remembered that thing, but it's gone. And hopefully you'll know that you can document it in one form or another. Leanne Luigi, I cleaned out my strawberry bed over a month ago and it grew back in with lush green leaves and more runners. Is this okay to leave for winter in zone 5B, Michigan? Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's what's happened with my strawberries. The deer ate them and they grew back, and the deer ate them and they grew back, and the deer ate them and they grew back. And so that's happened 3 times now. And so going into the winter, that lush green growth will be nice and lush and green. And strawberries can actually handle a good amount of cold. They brush off the freezing conditions with no problem. But at some point, especially in zone 5B, 5B means that we will get down to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That's minus 26 Celsius. That's the zone I'm into. And so at some point, for me, it's usually the end of December, beginning of January, all of my strawberry leaves have turned brown. What I do is I just leave those brown leaves on the plant because they'll catch the leaves that are blowing in the wind. They'll capture the snow, and that will help insulate those strawberry plants. I'm not a big fan of cleaning up the leaves early because you want to protect that strawberry crown. And so having new green growth on your strawberries means you'll have extra leaves that will be that protection for the strawberries going into the winter. And then in the spring, you can cut off and brush off all those leaves and the strawberries will sprout right back again. As far as the runners are concerned, if it's going to be freezing conditions soon, if you're going to be getting into your winter soon, which you may be in your part of Michigan, you can go ahead and cut off the runners, and that will just help direct the energy to the plant. Even when the plant is being stressed and the runners have no chance of rooting, the plant is still going to be sending energy out to that runner. And so you can just help the plant hold some of its energy by cutting off those runners now if there's no hope. If they've already started rooting, I'd go ahead and leave the runners attached to the plant, and those young plants may survive your winter as well. And so there's strawberries are one of those plants that I actually don't spend a lot of labor on because they kind of take care of themselves. A couple times a year I'll do the cleanup and I'll do the mulching, but other than that I just kind of let nature deal with my strawberries, and they actually do pretty well. Ethan in zone 9-5B, heavy clay soil. Is it best to amend to plant in ground or just go with a raised bed? Do you find greater success with in ground and weeds? So for me, I have a very sandy, infertile soil. It's terrible. And so for me, the raised beds are better because I can fill those raised beds with really good soil, and then I can concentrate my soil amendments in those beds. The pathways don't need to be amended. The rest of the garden doesn't need to be amended. This is for my vegetable garden. Those beds have ideal soil. I often recommend that in heavy clay areas as well. The solution for heavy clay is to add organic matter. Every year, add organic matter. It's going to take a while to add enough organic matter to overcome the problem of heavy clay. So if you want to do in-ground gardening, you can expect 3, maybe 4 years before that soil will really get to the point that you will have regular success, that the plants are doing great. It's going to take that long to overcome that heavy clay problem. Whereas if you put raised beds in the first season, you can start having better success because the soil in those raised beds is soil that you created, soil that you purchased, soil that you know to be healthy and productive. So I don't find greater success with in-ground beds, partly because of the weeds. In my raised beds, it's really easy as I wander through and water to just pluck out the weeds as I see them emerge. And so my raised beds are virtually weed-free. There's still some weeds that grow, and occasionally I just don't get to it. But my in-ground beds have a ton of weeds because to pull those weeds, I got to bend over, I got to pull it out. I don't want to bend over and pull out weeds. So I tell myself I'll get it at the end of the week. And then maybe at the end of the week, I'll spend half an hour and pull all the weeds from the in-ground beds. But usually on that day, I got something else to do. And so now it's a month that those weeds have been growing, and it becomes labor to deal with the weeds in my in-ground beds. So I find it easier to build good soil and actually easier to weed my vegetable garden when I grow in the raised beds. But it all comes down to what you prefer and how you like to garden. I like to do the raised bed gardening personally, and those are 2 big reasons why I do the raised bed gardening. Okay, let's see. I was saying I'd go sunken raised bed, dig down and amend. It's too hot to go high. And you know, that's one of those things, particularly in the southwest of the United States. Sunken beds are really a good way to do it. The high temperatures and the low humidity in some of those regions, and I had a conversation with a grower or gardener in Spain that was dealing with some of those issues. The raised beds dry out faster. That's definitely true. The soil temperature isn't much different, but they do dry out. They do require more water, and a sunken bed will require less water and will actually tend to keep the plants a little bit cooler. However, in my area, I've tried sunken gardens, and I have a garden friend who does the pit. He'll dig a trench, and that's where he'll plant his plants. The problem he's had and the problem I've had is that here in Colorado in summer, we get downpours from thunderstorms. It's not unusual for a thunderstorm to drop an inch or 2 of rain within 30 minutes. It doesn't happen often, but it happens often enough that what's happened to me in my gardens when I've planted in those sunken beds is that onslaught of rain causes the soil around that sunken bed to wash in and cover up the plants. So if you do a sunken bed, I highly recommend that you put a wall around it so that if you get the torrential rain like I do, you're not going to have the soil rushing into that bed. And then it can actually be very effective, especially when it comes to amending the soil, as Iwan suggests, is dig down, pull out some of the soil that you may not want to grow in, and then fill that space with the good soil, just like you would fill a raised bed with soil. And that can actually be pretty efficient, pretty productive, and pretty effective. So add that to your bag of tricks if it's something that you might want to consider. If you have an issue with the beds like that, Gardens Happen says, I'd like to do a sunken bed, just need to figure out how to keep them from flooding during the rainy season. Yeah, exactly. That's the point. And so it's one of those things for areas in a rainy climate. You might not get that sudden downpour like I do, but if you get steady rain, you're essentially just creating a place for the water to collect and drown your plants. And so I have seen some systems, and you could do this with a big pot even. You take a big pot, or you take a what would be a raised bed above the surface, but has a floor to it, and you bury the whole thing. So now it becomes sunken, but it's got sides and a bottom, and is less likely to flood and become saturated. Especially if it's going to be rainy, you can cover something like that to help keep the rain out. So that might be something to consider as far as an option. So I want to go ahead and talk about the background today. I just actually lost my sheet. See where it fell. I want to make sure that I have it. It's Stacy Griffin. I thought it was Stacy. I couldn't remember Stacy's last name. So anyway, the background behind me today is from Stacy Griffin. And thank you for sharing that. There's a lot about her garden that I like, and I want to point out, as we're talking about sunken beds and raised beds and in-ground beds. We often think about our gardens as that separate space that is somewhere in our backyard or somewhere in our landscape, and we're digging in it and we're creating garden beds. Well, look at what Stacy has done on her patio here. She actually has the patio, you can see extending way out there, all the way over here. She's got a little greenhouse that sits right on the patio. She's got dozens of pots that are growing plants. And so this looks a lot like a garden you and I would have in ground or in raised beds, but it's actually sitting on a concrete patio. So don't think that you are limited in your gardening because you don't have that spot to put a garden in. If you've got space, even on top of concrete, you can have grow bags and grow all these beautiful plants. You can have your pots of varying sizes, and some of them are up, some of them are down. You got the greenhouse in the background. Here in the back, you can see what looks to be a hoop tunnel, maybe. I'm not sure if that's plastic or what that is made of, but it's one of these things that you can modify your garden to grow that fits the space you have to grow. And so this is wonderful, especially, and I really like this. I'll be doing more and more of this with the colored pots. I love adding color to the garden. So if you're going to grow in pots, might as well have purple pots. Why not? And then, of course, your garden buddy has to be joining you, and that's something I think we all can benefit from, is having our buddy in the garden. But this is just a wonderful space. One of the things that I don't see a lot of is the greenhouse on top of a patio. Many of us will do the containers, like the bags and the pots, but to actually put the greenhouse on your patio, why not? if you're not using the patio for anything else, and this is a big patio space, go ahead and put your greenhouse in there. So lots of good things. You can see the sun in the background, and so I'm guessing there's a few issues. So many of these pots are raised, and so I'm guessing there are some issues if you look at some of these shadows developing right here. To get the most sun, Stacy has probably figured out that she needs to raise the pots off the ground. That's one of those things when your plants aren't doing well and you say, why aren't my plants doing well? If they could only get 30 minutes extra sun, they would probably do better. Well, raising them on plant stands might give you that extra 30 minutes of sun that you need for your plants to be successful. So lots of interesting ideas. There's one right here. It looks like it's an upside down pot with a pot on top of the upside down pot. Like she ran out of pot stands. Yeah, use a pot to be your pot stand for another pot. Another good example of some things that you can try. And then of course, back here, the sitting area. I really do like sitting areas in gardens. So comfortable chairs, the table, so you can sit and enjoy your garden. Why not outside your back door on your patio? Don't even have to travel far. So thank you, Stacy, for sharing that. I think this has got some really nice lessons, and it's a beautiful garden that we hopefully can all learn something about. And just goes to show that you can have a nice, big, productive garden and do it all in pots. You don't have to worry about the in-ground beds or the raised beds. So Urban Chicken Mama says the greenhouse is actually in a gravel hole. It used to be a hot tub area. Oh, I like that idea. This area gets sun until 4 p.m. Okay, there you go. Yeah, it's not a lot of sun. So thank you. That's a good idea. The hot tub. Many of us have had hot tubs in the past. And the house I had a couple houses ago, we had to call the junk people to take the hot tub away because we just never used it and it was taking up too much space. But if you got a gravel pit, that's even a better idea. What would you do with a gravel pit in an area on your patio? Put a greenhouse over it. I love it. That's absolutely wonderful. So add that to your bag of tricks. I think that is a wonderful example of how to take an area that you wouldn't know what else to do with and make it productive. I really like that idea. So that's beautiful. Juanita says, I love that garden. Reminds me of mine. Good. Use everything and anything, and it's so lush. Fantastic. So that's wonderful. And I really appreciate when you all send me the photos of your gardens, because I'm always learning and I'm always looking for new ideas. And for those of you that are taking notes in your garden journal, use this photo as an example. If there's anything about the picture of this garden that strikes your fancy, document it. Put it in your garden journal as something to try. That's one of the things that I use my loose leaf binder for. Just ideas. I got pages of ideas. And I'll have an idea, I'll put it in my sheet, and I'll forget about it. And then when it comes time to plan the garden season, I'll go back to that sheet. It's like, oh yeah, that's right. I wanted to get some purple pots this year. Now on your to-do list, you get purple pots or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, if there's anything about this and all of the other backgrounds that I show, make note of it so that you don't forget it and maybe incorporate it into your garden at some point in the future. And of course, if you want me to include a picture of your garden, please send it to me at gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com, and do include the permission to use it. I get a lot of photos, and some of them are people just wanting to share their photos with me. If you don't specifically say you have my permission to use this on your live stream, then I won't use it. And so I get a lot of pictures that maybe were intended to be included as a backdrop picture, but because it didn't say so in the email that they sent me, then I won't post it. I don't want to post something that you don't want to share. And that's really what it comes down to. So feel free to send me pictures of your garden. putting them in landscape format works best. You don't need to drop the size of the picture. I can modify that as needed, unless you need to do it because the email won't send. But I'm always looking for new photos and new ideas, and you all have that information that you can share with me and with the others. So do it. GardenerScott@gardenerscott.com, and you might see your photo in the backdrop. I think that's one of those things that I like to share. I like to view. I like to look at. And so I know many of you like to do it as well. So have fun with it. Okay, let's see. So CW is wondering, how's the spider farmer tent? And so I just did that video. I'm going to be doing something, and this is ideal for the concept of a garden journal, because this is something new for me. Now, I'm going to be documenting it in my videos so that you can follow along on the journey. And this is really a good way that I use for documenting. And one of the reasons I do the videos the way I do it is for me. I make my videos for me as much as I make them for you, so that I'm documenting the background. I'm documenting the beds. I'm documenting the plants. I do all that as one way for me to journal. And those of you that have started the channels of your own and are starting to do more and more videos, feel free to do that for yourself as you make videos. They're part of your journaling experience. Well, the Spider Farmer Grow Tent is one of these new things I'm trying, and I'm documenting it over the course of a series of videos. And I'm in the process right now of figuring out the plants I'm going to put in it. So just yesterday, we had a freeze last night. And so I did a video a couple months ago about cloning tomatoes. And so some of those cuttings that I had taken from my tomato plants, I put into a pot, and some I put into raised beds. They all grew. They actually did extremely well. But the one that was in the pot, I actually brought into the house. And that's the first thing I'm going to attempt to grow in my Spider Farmer Grow Tent. Now, it did get hit by an unexpected, the forecast temperature was supposed to be 34 degrees a couple days ago. That's just over 1 degree Celsius, but it actually was 31 degrees, about minus half Celsius. And so there was damage on that tomato plant. I think by bringing it in, as soon as I saw that damage, I will be able to save it. And if I can save it, then it's going into the grow tent. But so far, to answer your question, it's great. It's a 3 foot by 3 foot footprint, and it's 5 feet high. And my plan is to grow at least that tomato, and then also start some seeds of peppers and some other plants and grow it in the grow tent. And then I'll be keeping track of it. This is something I haven't done before, so I can anticipate what's going to happen, but I'm going to be documenting what actually happens, and I'll be sharing it with you. So if it's one of these things that you've been wondering about, you might consider a grow tent now or at some point in the future. So you can check out that video if you haven't seen it before. Grow tents are an interesting idea. I grew some plants in a small room at my last house, and I had mylar sheets on the wall. That's one of the nice things about a grow tent, is on the inside it's reflective. And so I essentially turned a very small room into a grow area and tried to replicate what a grow tent does for you very easily, and had some good success growing the plants in that area. Now I want to see if a dedicated grow tent will give me the same kind of success. Key among them for me is humidity. We are so dry in the winter, single-digit humidity, that growing some of these plants that do better in high humidity, I can't grow them in my house because my household humidity is just too dry. But I should be able to grow them in a grow tent where I can have a higher humidity in that enclosed space. So I'm looking forward to it. And yeah, definitely follow along as you watch the videos as I figure out what I'm going to be doing with the grow tent in the future. So Robin's Container Garden, a tip for remembering to journal. Keep the journal near to the garden items you use the most. Good idea. I keep mine by my trowel or gloves. Now it's near the scales for weighing harvest. That's really a good idea. Thank you for that, Robin. And that's why for me, my spiral notebook is right on the table next to my chair, and I'm in that chair watching TV and working on my computer, and I can just reach over and grab my spiral notebook and make a note in it. And I do that all the time when it comes to planning and preparing for videos that I'll be making. I do the same thing. I'll just make notes for whatever video I got planned, and I'll have a sheet for that video. And while I'm writing for that video, it's like, oh yeah, and then I'll go to the journal section of that spiral notebook and do the same thing, because it's nearby, it's at my fingertips, and when I have that thought, it's really easy to do. And yeah, putting it by your tools and your gloves, that's really a good tip, because believe me, garden journal doesn't do you any good if you don't use it. I've got those garden journals taking up space on my shelf, and that's all they're doing, is taking up space on my shelf because they're empty. I'm not using them. I'm doing it in different ways. And if you put all of your hope and your ambition into that garden journal and then it stays empty, well, then it's just wasted space. So do try to figure out some way that it's going to be beneficial for you, that you're actually going to use it, and you're going to get out there and find a way to make it beneficial for yourself. I talked about weighing the vegetables is one of the things I document. Back at the Galileo Garden, we used weight as part of our ambition, our goals, what we were going to do in the garden. The very first year after we had built the raised beds for that school garden, we grew 1,400 pounds of produce. And I know that because whenever we harvested, I had the kids weigh what we were harvesting. And so that adds another component to your journaling, is get the other people in your household involved with the journaling as well. Your kids can weigh and then you write it down in your journal, or you can weigh and they write it down in your journal. It doesn't need to be just you doing the journaling. It could be a household garden journal. And maybe everybody has a section, maybe everybody has their own journal. But the idea is anyone that has an interest or conceivably might develop an interest in gardening, help them become part of the garden journal. And the kids got into it. In the second year, we grew over 2,000 pounds of produce. And in that second year, we had many of the kids from the first year. So I had students coming to the garden. That's what they wanted to do. Didn't matter what I wanted to do, whether we were starting seeds or weeding or whatever. They wanted to weigh the harvest because they knew it was important. It was part of what we were documenting and keeping track of. And so it's hard to tell what aspect of gardening each of us will find important. You might be one of those kind of people that just likes the data and likes keeping track of it. Eli shared with me some of the weather data that she's been tracking on a minute-by-minute basis. Now, was tracking weather in the past on an hour-by-hour basis. I have since developed it more into a day-by-day basis. But there are ways to develop as much data as you could conceivably gather when it comes to your garden. So start highlighting what it is that's important to you. And it may be just the gathering of the data that is the important factor. But I became obsessed at the Galileo Garden with collecting the data. And I had spreadsheets of all different kinds. I had graphs. I would give a presentation, to the principal. I gave a presentation to the school board, and I could back up my presentation with all of this data that I'd been documenting for years. And when I would go to help at another school for them to develop their school garden, and I would give my suggestions and advice, I had hard data to support what it was I was sharing with them. I love the data collection. Why not? If you're a data collector, go ahead and use a journal as an excuse to scratch that itch that you might have in collecting all the information that you could possibly collect. So just take that under advisement. Sunset gazing. I bought some heavy mill plastic from Ag Fabric to construct maybe a side of house makeshift greenhouse for winter, easily removed when not needed. I have the material and the tools. That sounds like a great idea. Putting a lean-to or a half hoop next to your house is a great option because your house will actually produce some of the heat, the supplemental heating that area can use in the cold months. So good for you. I like that idea. Have fun with that. Have some success with it. Bud is saying one set of data that helps me is automated now. I have weather and soil temperature probes logging to my computer. It's so helpful. Good for you, Bud. Yeah, I'm going to be doing that soon. And you may be seeing a video on some of that, my planned automation for keeping track of some of the data. That is an excellent idea. And I, in many respects, I'm a lazy gardener. So if I can find a way to automate it like Bud, I completely think that's a direction to go. So good for you. Jay, I helped convince a critical non-gardener of the value of my garden by estimating the retail value of my organic produce. There you go. And that's one reason why I've been documenting my harvest so well this year, is because I'll be doing a video on that exact topic, Jay, here pretty soon, where I'll be talking about the value of a garden. And one of the value components is the cost. And so by documenting what I've done this year, even though I like to document it, it's specific for a video that I'm planning to make. But if you can use that information to help a non-gardener, oh, I love that idea. Good for you, Jay. Thanks for sharing that. Tammy says, for someone who wants to write in your journal, but keep those journals digitally, check out Rocketbook notebooks. Oh, I don't know them. You write in it, then use the app to upload it directly to a folder. Good. Thanks for that tip, Tammy. And yeah, anything to make it easy. That's really one of those things that you got to do. Juanita, I record everything in an actual paper journal. Freeze, thaw, plants I use, pests of the year, when sown and harvested, how much produce, what I use to amend, how much rainfall, weird experiments. There you go. If you've never done a garden journal before, right there is a good list of what you can do to start your garden journal and have some success with it. So Juanita has hit on really good topics and lots of the important stuff that I like to document as well. So make note of that and add it to your plan for your garden journal. And if you're not doing some of these things, I think all of these are really good things to document. So if you're not recording some of these things, add them to your list of what you are recording. Good suggestion. Good suggestion. Okay. So one of the things that and I've kind of mentioned it briefly as we've been talking today, is that all of this, the journaling, the experimenting, the planting, the planning, it's all for your garden. And try not to lose sight of that, because when it comes to the garden journals, especially the ones you buy, whoever put that journal together, put it together based on their experiences from their garden. And it may or may not match what you're doing. It's okay for you to develop your own methods, your own styles, your own ways to collect data that will match with you and your garden. And ultimately, the bottom line is your garden is your garden, and you are the only one that you need to please, and you are really the only one that needs to be happy with your garden. Most of the time, you're the only one that is unhappy with your garden. So really try to point out those things that do make you happy, those successes, those things that should be documented, those pictures, those things that you want to remember because it's your garden. This time of year, it kind of makes me chuckle a little bit because it's already started happening. So I had frost. My plants started to suffer. I didn't clean up areas that I was planning to clean up. And you can see them in my garden. Even though I make videos that thousands and thousands of people see, my garden is my garden. I'm not gardening for you. I'm not gardening for anybody else. I'm gardening for myself. And I'm okay with sharing the weeds and the dead plants and those chores that I haven't gotten to yet. But this time of year, this is what makes me chuckle, is new people who don't know the Gardener Scott channel and maybe have never seen a video of mine before will start seeing some of these videos where plants are dead and the background doesn't look pretty and green and lush, and they tell me how terrible my garden looks. Well, you know what? I don't care what you think about my garden, especially if you tell me my garden looks terrible, because I know just a few weeks ago my garden looked great and I was happy with it. A gardener, in my opinion, does not criticize another gardener because their garden doesn't look or doesn't meet the expectation that they have of someone else's garden. Your garden is your garden. And so I've cleaned up a number of my beds. I have a lot more cleanup to do, and a lot more of my plants have been killed by the freeze that we just had overnight. If I don't clean up those plants and I make a video with dead plants in the background, you'll see it. That's the reality of gardening. I'm not gardening for anyone but myself, and I'm okay when it doesn't look good. I'm okay that the fact that there's dead plants just reminds me I've got another chore to do at some point in the future to clean up that bed at some point. Some of those dead plants I leave on purpose, like the flower heads that will provide seeds for the birds over the course of the winter. I'm not embarrassed that my garden doesn't look pretty all the time. In fact, I think it helps me look like a real and regular person in my videos. And so don't let the changing weather, especially when your plants start dying, and especially in areas where your neighbors might see it, try not to let that impact you negatively. They may be thinking, oh man, Rebecca's garden just looks terrible. It was so beautiful and now it looks terrible. They may say something to you about it. My neighbor does to me occasionally. She drops little hints when things aren't looking great. Okay, she's still my neighbor. I'll still talk to her. I'll still let her look at my dead plants until I clean them up, because it's my garden and I'm going to work on my schedule to make myself happy and not be embarrassed by it, and even reach the point where I'm willing to show thousands of people the reality of gardening. Now, it does annoy me when someone who doesn't know me and comments on a video that says something to the effect of, your plants in the background have died. Obviously, you don't know how to water. When in actuality, it's because I live in the Colorado mountains and we had a freeze and that killed the plant. I don't comment. I don't respond. I figure that person will learn enough about gardening and maybe will have some of those lessons of what causes plants to die when you don't want them to die. But I'm not going to hide that from you because I don't hide it from myself. It's part of gardening and I'm proud of it. And I learn lessons about all of that. This year, my cucumbers were pretty productive, but cucumbers have a lifespan. The plant will suffer and be stressed and begin to die long before most of the other plants in the garden. And so in some of my recent videos where I talk about my peppers and how beautiful they look, you can see in the background my dead cucumber plants. They didn't die because they didn't get water. They were in the same bed as the beautiful pepper plants. They died because it was the end of their life. And I just didn't clean that bed yet. I'm okay with that. You should be okay with that. Don't feel like you have to perform and make your garden look better than the reality. Make your garden look as good as you want your garden to look for yourself, and that'll help make you successful and happy and make the garden a welcoming place. And I think that's ultimately what it's all about. Yeah, there's chores to do. Yeah, it reminds you that you wanted to do it a couple weeks ago and you just haven't got around to it yet, but you're going to get around to it. I'm going to get around to it. Some of the stuff that I haven't cleaned up yet is because I got a video coming where I'm going to show you how to clean up a lot of that stuff. I'm okay with that. You should be okay with that. So as you move forward into this next week, as more and more of you encounter these freezing conditions and more of you have gardens that just don't look pretty anymore, don't worry about it. Enjoy it. Document it all in your garden journal, and it will all be good, useful data for the future. I'm going to be back here next Monday for another good gardening topic to share with you. And I look forward to reviewing what you've been talking about and trying to get some of the tips from some of the information that I didn't include today, because I know your comments are loaded with good information because you all are wonderful gardeners and I appreciate spending my time with you. I hope you have a great gardening week, and I will see you back next Monday. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.